Well, thank you all for coming today. Thank you so much for Dr. Archer and for really this Aftermaths event. This has been really interesting, being able to participate just by attending the first two events and then, of course, getting to have the opportunity to speak to you today on the third event. It's just been a really, I think, important moment for us to think about in different ways how we can recognize the legacy of World War II it has on our world today and how it can continue to shape where we want to go in the future, which is really what history is always trying to do. Also, thank you to the Dorsey B. Hardeman Endowment. They're what really helps to make this possible and to allow for these kind of enriching events that you get to come to. I realize that most of you are probably here for extra credit, but I hope that if nothing else, you will walk away with gaining more information and more perspective about the event of the Holocaust than maybe you had before you got here today. When Dr. Archer asked me to participate in the program and to speak on a topic related to the Holocaust, she kind of gave me a blank check in a sense of the word. And I will confess that I was simultaneously excited, as excited as you can be about talking about the Holocaust, and overwhelmed at thinking, how am I going to approach this topic with you with the kind of framework of the aftermaths? But having been the third person of this series, I had the benefit of kind of getting to see and hear what our other two series have done that have largely looked at this kind of relationship between the United States and its role in World War II, as well as the kind of relationship between the United States and particularly Germany and Nazi Germany. And so in as much today, I'm going to be talking to you about the role of both the U.S. military and American policy in responding to the Holocaust and its immediate aftermath when liberating and occupying Germany at the war's end. I think, one of the things that Dr. Archer made a great point about is that this is an event that, you as a younger generation have the responsibility to carry on so that future generations continue to know about it. And that's such an important moment because the people that we're going to be talking about today are people who were survivors of this horrific regime, as well as people who bore witness to what happened at this regime. They very much felt that pressure. They felt the responsibility. They felt that they were going to be responsible for bearing witness for the future. And so they helped to give us a really good blueprint of what we can do and how we can continue to remember this particular event. So while I'm sure many of you that are here today have heard or are familiar with the term Holocaust before, hopefully having learned some of its basic elements in history classes, either in high school or maybe here at ASU. But I want to make sure everybody's on the same page and that we're all operating from the same definition. So I want to kind of provide that to you here. The Holocaust, which lasted from 1933 to 1945, was the systematic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of 6 million European Jews by the Nazi Germany regime and its allies and collaborators. In addition to perpetrating the Holocaust, Nazi Germany also persecuted and murdered millions of other victims, including political opponents, chief among them being socialists and communists, Poles, the Roma, those with physical and mental disabilities, as well as anyone that was determined by the Nazis to be inferior or weakening the German race. All in all, this systematic persecution and mass murder would culminate in the deaths of an estimated 10 million people. The Nazis carried out these goals through an elaborate process of first kind of stripping Jews of civic and social rights within the German nation, and then continuing to do so as they expanded their control into other parts of Europe. Once these rights are stripped, the Nazis are going to set up a series of containment camps and centers, right? Kind of the first being concentration camps, then the creation of things called ghettos, and finally extermination centers. And the purpose of an extermination center is just what the title indicates. It is primarily to kill. They are killing centers where their primary purpose is just to kill those victims. So with that definition in mind, this is a disclaimer, or trigger warning, that the images and the testimonies that you're going to see here today are incredibly difficult. We're talking about an intentional, brutal destruction of human life that's perpetrated by other humans and that is motivated by a violent ideology. And we should never be comfortable with that. You should feel uncomfortable. but I do believe it's our responsibility to address it. I promise I will not cry through this whole thing. Okay. But it's hard not to when you carry the weight of knowing this. So the first thing I want you to kind of get a sense of is a little bit of the scope, and it's really hard to fully grapple with this. Is this map is showing you the construction of major camps that are built in Nazi-occupied territory, whether that be the German state itself or in the areas that they will control surrounding them. There are hundreds of camps, kind of what we would call main camps, and then there are smaller sub-camps that will feed into the larger camp, all situated in what is today, what we know today to be Poland, will be those extermination centers. So what we'll be looking at, what we'll be talking about, is the U.S. military's connection to particularly concentration camps, because that's what they will liberate. So the first question I want us to think about is, what does the U.S. know? What does the United States, its population, its government know about the Holocaust before the war was over? Right, to help kind of get us a sense. Were they expecting to see what they were going to see when they do actually get to these camps in April of 1945? Now, there is never a doubt about Nazism's virulent anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish position. That is incredibly clear from the absolute beginning. Through propaganda, speeches, through the actions of destroying civic and social rights of groups like Jews within the German Reich. This has been going on since the Nazis will seize power. However, the idea that there would be a coordinated and intentional mass murder of Jews or really of any other group was very hard for most people to comprehend. That this was not something that they really had a category for comprehending or even really discussing within American media or within American policy. What I have pictured for you here, these are three headlines from three different American newspapers in the years kind of right after the Nazis seized power and they began to exercise some of these policies where we see references being made to them being held as prisoners, being denied citizenship, and then again specific elements of actions taken against the Jews. But it's not going to come until November of 1942. So after America's already entered the war at the end of 1941, that newspapers start to report on information that they've received that about 2 million Jews had been murdered by this point. The World Jewish Congress's representative in Switzerland, the man you see there on the left, Gerhard Regner, had tried to report this information to his organization's president, Rabbi Stephen Weiss, who was in the United States. And he had tried to get this information to him, sending it through the U.S. Department of State. State Department officials tried to block Regner's report from reaching Rabbi Weiss. They claimed that the planned murder of European Jews was merely a war rumor, right? That this was just something that was trying to stir up potential sympathies for the United States getting more and more involved against Nazi Germany or creating some other kind of context. Yet, after investigating Regner's report over the next 3 months, State Department officials verified the news of the Nazi regime's plan and, according to Wise, authored him to inform the American public. And in response to this news, Jewish communities all throughout the United States and in other allied nations started to hold rallies and vigils, declaring international days of mourning. There was even an effort by the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, right? These are kind of allied partners in the war. They released a statement called the Declaration on Atrocities in December of 1942. And this declaration condemned the, quote, bloody cruelties and, quote, cold-blooded extermination of Europe's Jews and vowed that the Allies would punish war criminals after the fighting had stopped. However, it made no promise to initiate any rescue efforts. Okay, so there's never really an effort taken by U.S. military policy or U.S. officials to try and rescue or stop the actions that are taking place as they are discovering about them. Additional details of the ongoing Nazi mass murder of European Jews will trickle out into the public in 1943, when American Jews, who were really kind of divided on how they should respond to and how much pressure they should exert onto the federal government to take action against Jews. Some worried that too much pressure and playing too much into this sympathy might create as a backlash, an anti-Semitic backlash upon Jews within the United States, and create another difficult context for Jews in the United States. Others insisted that public pressure would be the only way to spark government action to try to rescue victims before the war ended. A few will try some of these tactics. Rabbi Stephen Weiss, the individual you see there on the right, he actually is going to sponsor a massive pro-rescue rally in Madison Square Garden, where upwards of 70,000 people will attend in 1943. You've even got individual activists, and a man named Peter Bergson forms a group called the Emergency Committee to Save the Jewish People of Europe, who operates and tries to launch a propaganda campaign in the United States to try to raise awareness of the plight of European Jews. And then you've got non-Jewish activists as well. One individual, a man named Jan Karski, he was a member of the Polish underground resistance who had been able to escape Poland after they are taken over by the Nazis. And he had witnessed the horrors suffered by Jews both in the Warsaw Ghetto and in a transit camp near a Jewish ghetto in the German-occupied Poland region. Karski will meet face-to-face with President Roosevelt at the White House in July of 1943 and tell the president about the dire situation that Jews are facing under these Nazi policies. Karski later recalled that FDR promised that the Allies would win the war, but that the president made no mention of rescuing Jews. So kind of this continuation of this, we're going to win, by winning the war is the best way to end this process, but there's no intentional efforts beyond that they're seemingly taken at this point. In November of 1943, Bergson's emergency committee persuaded members of Congress through that propaganda campaign that he had launched to introduce a resolution intended to pressure President Roosevelt to appoint a commission responsible for rescuing Jews. This to the point where this resolution is put forward before Congress, gets the Assistant Secretary of the State to have to come testify before Congress. And in his testimony, he claimed that the State Department had been actively assisting Jewish refugees and had admitted somewhere upwards of 580,000 refugees since 1933. Very quickly, Bergson and other advocates pointed out that this was completely false, right? That there had not been anywhere near that number of refugees allowed into the country, Jewish or otherwise, by the U.S. government. It would only take, though, finally, an investigation by the Treasury Department when it was discovered that the Department of State had not been continuously sharing information that was coming out from Europe regarding the mass murder of Jews. So this tells us that we know that from the European side of events, information is getting out, right? It is known. It is not a secret. It is not hidden, but how much it's seemingly getting to the wider American public is what is unknown. And so this led President Roosevelt to form what was called the War Refugee Board in 1944. This was an independent government agency that was supposed to kind of come alongside U.S. military policy and aid, whether in private relief efforts or through more coordinated channels like maybe the Red Cross, to try and assist those who are experiencing persecution under the Nazis. The idea behind the War Refugee Board was to kind of streamline bureaucratic paperwork, make it easier, right, for individuals to kind of seek this refugee status, again, whether Jewish or non-Jewish, and then maybe also get funds sent to Europe. The War Refugee Board also launches a propaganda campaign to warn perpetrators, right? This propaganda campaign is not towards the American public, but towards the Nazis themselves and their supporters in Europe, to say, look, you're going to face legal punishments when this thing is over. We fully intend to punish these criminals for these crimes once the war is over. But what comes available, information that comes available in March of 1944, when the Nazi regime will invade Hungary. It is discovered that through this Nazi invasion of Hungary, that there has been this kind of creation of this new entity, this death center. One specifically they're going to talk about is in this information is Auschwitz, and that this center its primary purpose was just to kill individuals, like kill victims of the Holocaust. And so the suggestion is put forward through petitions made through the War Refugee Board to try and get the U.S. military to bomb rail lines that are feeding, so bringing people into these camps, and or possibly the camp itself under the auspices of the War Department, right? Basically make it a military tactic. But American officials explained that they would not do this. They rejected the proposals, and they would not do this in part, as they claimed, for a technicality. They said that their aircraft did not have the capacity to conduct air raids on such targets with sufficient accuracy, and in part with a strategic argument that the Allies were committed to bombing exclusive military targets in order to win the war as quickly as possible. So in subsequent decades, this particular decision by the Allied governments, and even more particularly the United States, to not bomb these gas chambers, to not bomb these rail lines, has led to some really intense debate as to whether or not they should. Some proponents say they should have, others should have not, saying that if those who say they should have said it would likely have slowed the process down. It likely would not have eliminated everything that was happening, but it would have slowed the process down. And Auschwitz was the largest of all the extermination centers. That at its peak, it could kill up to 6,000 people a day. So had they chosen to bomb this particular facility, it's likely that it could have at least diminished those numbers to the height that they would have been. So this kind of helps to give us a sense of that the United States is aware of what's happening. They're aware of what's going on. They do not make rescue efforts or even kind of the primary focus of the war ending the Holocaust or alleviating what's happening. But when they are going to enter into German lines through the liberation effort, this is really what's going to bring the awareness to an even greater extent, right? So there's really no specific policy the Americans are going to be pursuing except to just end the war, right? Defeat the Nazis, end the war. That's what's going to end the Holocaust. So the liberation of Germany happens from two different sides. You've got the Soviets, who are going to be pushing westward, and they're getting to the western border of, or they're pushing westward, getting to the eastern border of Germany. And then you've got a combined American, British, and kind of French resistance group pushing, moving eastward to its western border. And how these camps, how these places are going to be liberated are based upon what army gets there first. So all of the extermination centers are liberated by the Soviet army. Some of them had already kind of ceased in operation. As the Germans or the Nazis are aware that the Soviets are getting closer and closer, there's a very intentional effort to try and shut down some of these camps and take whatever prisoners they've got, load them up either onto rail cars and send them back into German proper land, so in the boundaries of Germany, or to put them on what were called death marches, where they literally forced them to march hundreds of miles of inadequate food, clothing, shoes, all this kinds of stuff to get back into this. In large part because the Nazi soldiers who are still at these camps, they don't want to be Soviet prisoners of war. They don't want to be, they don't see it as being liberated by the Soviets, right? So they want to try and get out and get away from them as quickly as possible. And I mention that to you because it's going to be something that our American soldiers and such will see and experience with the kind of heightened numbers that some of these camps will experience in the very last months of the war, with some of those death marches or some of those death trains that are bringing people back from those centers in Poland to Germany proper itself. So this means that the camps that American military personnel will encounter are going to be concentration camps. And concentration camps are a type of prisoner camp. They're going to be utilizing them as a form of slave labor through also means of dehumanization. They'll do medical experiments. They will do all types of different things, as well as extracting labor from the prisoners of these camps as well. The very first, as we'll kind of go through some of these specifically, the very first camp that our Americans will come into contact with is going to be the camp of Ohrdruf, and then they'll also liberate Buchenwald, Dachau, and Mauthausen. And so I'm going to give you some kind of just general examples and observations of what takes place through this liberation and this interaction. Now, what it should also be noted is that when these soldiers are moving in and they're pressing inward, the war is not over yet. Hasn't officially been, won't officially be over till early May of 1945. But it's understood that as this American army gets to these places, that these prisoners and the kind of occupation of them, the control of them, will hopefully be over. And as they are interacting with them, they don't know the soldiers don't know what to expect. They don't know what they're coming up upon. As evidence shows in a lot of their accounts, as they got to be a couple of miles out from some of these camps, the very first thing that they would notice is the smell, which should also tell us that the people who are living around these camps and in these vicinities could never make the claim that they did not know what was going on or that they were oblivious to these actions, because just the smell in and of itself of the rotting corpses, the disease-ridden nature, as well as that many people around these camps are economically benefiting from the slave labor, from what's coming out of these camps. So they started to kind of notice things as they're getting closer and closer to them. So the first camp that is going to be liberated is a subcamp of the larger camp Buchenwald called Ohrdruf, and it is liberated on April the 5th of 1945, when units from the American 4th Armored Division of the 3rd Army were the first Americans there to discover a camp with prisoners. This camp had about 10,000 male slave inmates, some of whom had been sent on those death marches from further eastward. They find corpses of bodies shot and thrown into pits. They also find what you're seeing there in that particular image, and I should also disclaim this is where the images start to get really awful, but that these corpses are stacked on top of each other and then burned. These are basically become crematoria pyres that you're seeing here. At this particular camp are the generals George Patton, Omar Bradley, and Dwight Eisenhower, and they arrived to Ohrdruf on April the 12th, a few days after the camp is initially found by these soldiers. It also happens to be the same day that President Roosevelt dies, and that they're informed about his death. And when these generals arrive, they find about 3,200 naked and emaciated bodies in shallow graves. Eisenhower found a shed piled to the ceiling with bodies, various torture devices, and a butcher's block for smashing out gold fillings from the mouths of the dead. The Nazis were very intentional about stripping bodies of anything that could be of potential value, whether that be clothing or items, gold fillings, as well as their hair. General Patton became physically ill when witnessing this. In fact, he was not able to tour the camp. He refused to do so, believing that he was going to be sick throughout the entirety of it. Eisenhower, initially, according to kind of his own reflection, kind of turned white at the scene of the gates, and he insisted on seeing, quote, every nook and cranny of the camp, wanting to be able to say that he had witnessed this firsthand. He said, quote, "We are told that the American soldier does not know what he was fighting for. Now, at least, he will know what he was fighting against." And it was after touring Ohrdruf that Eisenhower sent a telegram to Washington, and the quote, I have it here on the screen for you. It says, "The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were overpowering. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in position to give first-hand evidence of these things, if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." Eisenhower then proceeded to encourage American soldiers in the vicinity of a concentration camp all throughout the kind of western areas of Germany that they had liberated to tour those sites, take photographs, write letters back to their families in the United States, and describe what they had seen. He also then arranged for delegations of journalists and members of Congress to tour the recently liberated camps. This is a very important moment because what it's going to do is it's going to establish this leadership moment of where the United States sees, particularly through the role of these generals, whether it's Eisenhower or Omar Bradley, that the need to document, the need to testify, the need to bring visual awareness. As I'll show you in a second, we'll have some letters that these soldiers will write home, and many of them can't really put into words what they're seeing, right? Imagine me having to describe to you without these images what's happening. It's so incredibly difficult. And so the intentional documentation through moving pictures as well as photographs and then written evidence, that this will all then be compounded by the experience of survivors themselves, their testimonies, helps to provide this really full picture as to what was actually going on, right? And I think it's so telling that they recognize the need to preserve this in this particular moment, right? That they saw the necessity for preserving that here and now. So as these camps continue to get liberated, like I said, this begins at Orduf and it kind of moves into different areas. These documentations, these images start to circulate throughout the U.S. Army in Europe and then as well as back home to try and publicize what was going on. General Omar Bradley, kind of echoing what Eisenhower had claimed, says, it is the desire of the theater commander that both still and moving pictures be utilized to the fullest extent practicable as exhibits and reports of investigations of war crimes committed by the Nazis, with particular reference to Allied prisoners of war both in and out of camps and to concentration camps, for the purpose of recording for civilization the history of horror written by over 5 years of German atrocities. In a legendary broadcast on April the 15th by the radio host Edward R. Murrow, he spoke directly to an American audience and kind of gave a very stunning matter-of-fact description of Buchenwald. As he's describing these piles of dead bodies, so emaciated that those shot through the head barely bled, and those who were still living with tattoos of numbers on their arms and whose ribs showed through their thin shirts. He says, quote, I pray to you, believe what I have said about Buchenwald. I have reported I've reported what I saw and heard, but only part of it. For most of it, I have no words. He added, if I have offended you by this rather mild account of Buchenwald, I am not in the least sorry. And so this, again, pressing sense of responsibility of not cloaking the reality of the situation and bringing, again, the horrors of these things to light. So some of the images that I'm showing you here are those shots taken by those U.S. Army personnel. A lot of them are taken by the U.S. Signal Corps for means of documentation, and that are going to be kind of the main source base. It's actually going to be used at the Nuremberg trials. But we also have soldiers who just have private cameras or even moving picture cameras, what we kind of call like a video recorder today. That are taking footage. And they're a really interesting effort done by both the National World War II Museum and the National Holocaust Museum in the United States to try and make sure we actually have all the copies of these, because sometimes people would go back home, they'd find them in their grandparents or whatever attic and don't even know what they've got, right? So we're trying to kind of continuously make sure we have all of these, and so that's where a lot of these images have come from. The image that you're seeing there on the left, this is a documentation of one of those rail cars that had been filled with prisoners and sent from the death camps in the east back into Germany proper, at Dachau. When the U.S. Army will liberate Dachau, they will encounter upwards of 40 cars of people filled completely dead, or who have been killed inside these cars on one of those death trains. The image on the right is bodies that they find of dead victims at Dachau before they have been cremated. They would have eventually been cremated. The image on the left here, again, I realize this is really, really awful to see. I tried to find the one that was the least awful to show you, because at some point it's become so overwhelming. These were a series of photos that we don't actually know who took them. They're an anonymous set of photos by a soldier who used two inmates at the camp and had them show to them how the process went from taking the body that had died through the process of taking that body to the crematoria, going through the furnace and then what happens afterwards, right? And with its remains and such. And so that is what those are. And then the image on the right, this is from the concentration camp of Nordhausen. And what's actually being shown to you there is that the U.S. military would get German civilians, so living in neighboring areas, neighboring towns and areas, to come and have to see the inside of these camps and to have to deal with these bodies, to dig graves or to help to deal with remains, human remains, as a means of educating, as a means of making aware. And again, there can be the idea that there would be no excuse for anyone being able to claim that they didn't know what was happening, or that they were unaware of what was happening. I mention this to you here and now because as we're kind of moving forward here after this point of liberation, the question is that what do you do now, right? What do you do that this has been discovered, that these crimes have now been made aware of? The question that should be coming to our minds is justice, right? How do you even begin to get justice for something like this? And part of what the American policy's position is a desire to what they call denazify, right? Denazify Germany and to democratize Germany. And the success of that is much debated in terms of how it can really take place. So here are just two examples. I realize you cannot read these letters. I just wanted to show you that these were up here. But I'll read you a short quote from the one on the left. This is from Reverend James Burkle Ficklin, who was a Presbyterian chaplain in the U.S. Army, who wrote this letter to his wife Carolyn, describing what he had witnessed after the liberation of the Ohrdruf concentration camp. He said, "I've seen so many things that are strange and hard to tell about that I hardly know where to begin. On Friday, I visited a camp where the Germans kept their slave laborers. This is the worst thing I've ever seen. The Germans starved their slave labor till they were living skeletons, and when they became too ill or weak to work, they killed them, stacked their bodies in a neat-looking little hut till they got around to hauling them about a mile further up the hill and arranging them on piles of rails." He goes on to say, "I saw other things that will hardly do to write about. That was a hell on earth if there ever was one." And the one on the right is another American soldier, Elmer Joachim, who will, when he sees and encounters Dachau, he says, we must see to believe, and I have seen Dachau, I believe." So what do you do, right? What do you do with both the logistical situation of these prisoners who have survived, with the massive loss of life, and with this concept of justice? Because this was never really a policy position by the U.S. military, they don't really have a plan of action. They don't really know what to do with these people. And it's not just the victims of the Holocaust that they are having to deal with, right? They're also going to be dealing with millions of what we would refer to largely as displaced persons, people who have been displaced by the war, that once the German boundaries have been kind of brought back to what they had been before the wars begin. Many of these people are forced to relocate, whether by choice or not, they're forced to relocate. So we're talking about millions and millions of people. And initially, the U.S. government set up these displaced persons camps, and they were just camps for anyone and everyone, whether or not you were a victim of the Holocaust and had spent part of your time in either a death center or a concentration camp, or you were, someone who was you were German who was living in Polish lands that you no longer can live there anymore and that you've been forcibly removed, right? So sometimes, and in some very unfortunate circumstances, you would have Germans, former Nazis, living in close proximity to Jews in some of these displaced person camps. The United States also tried to, under the kind of banner of the United Nations, tried to keep everything equal, right? Treating all peoples equal. They're not giving special treatment to one group or the other. But it didn't really produce the outcome of the idea that they were hoping. Plus, we don't really have trained personnel for this. There's, again, no clear policy. You've also got millions of people who really need both psychological and physical help, and they're just not cut out for this. So much to the point where President Truman, in the summer of 1945, will ask the U.S. Immigration Commissioner, a man named Earl Harrison, to tour these DP camps. And Harrison was shocked by what he found and informed Truman, says, quote, we appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis had treated them, except we don't exterminate them, right? Now, I think in some ways it's not an exact correlation. We weren't actually treating them in the same way, but the fact that we really didn't have a means by which to kind of respond to a scenario that they were not prepared to engage with. So much to the point where the United States policy shifts, where we start to formulate displaced person camps just for Jews themselves, right? We kind of begin to separate them out, recognizing that their experiences and what has happened to them is distinctively unique compared to some of these other displaced persons. You also have to remember that the fact that, as you can see on this map here, of these displaced person camps, and these are the ones that are created for displaced Jewish persons, that much of Germany is in complete and total rubble, right? Most average Germans have no home to go to. They have very little resources in which to survive, food and fuel and things like this. So everyone is really in a strain of struggling, especially, of course, those who have been victims of this regime. It is estimated that it usually took about 10 years for a person who was a victim of the Holocaust, who survived, to settle from the kind of immediate post-war context, right? So if you want to say 1945, probably took them up until 1955 to where they were actually settled and able to start to build lives and homes and careers and businesses and all this kind of thing. Because on top of all of this is the fact that most of these Jewish individuals have been stripped of all of their property, of their possessions, of any wealth that they may have had, right, that is gone, that they will not be able to get it back. And so they're quite literally starting from absolute nothing. However, in these displaced person camps, we'll see that in some of the images that we have documenting them, they immediately try to recreate life in a way that is one that can flourish, right? That they reconstitute familial bonds. Down at the bottom right is a picture of a wedding that takes place in early 1946. So there's an effort, and this is an important part, because what it's doing is that it is actively defying the Nazis by not only surviving, but thriving, right? It's doing exactly the opposite of what the Nazis wanted to do to them by the fact that they not only survived, but they're going to live their lives not in kind of the shadow of that. We also see an example of them going to school, educating their children, right? This becomes another element of what they're trying. They're trying to literally move on in as best way as is psychologically possible.
Right. Yeah.
So what kind of role does the United States have in kind of enacting an idea of justice for the crimes of the Holocaust? Well, as it was made clear in some of those early pre-war, pre-liberation statements, they were going to, enact justice. They were going to hold accountable individuals for the crimes that had taken place. And yet it's not as though this event, the entirety of the Holocaust and all of the victims of this regime, can be reduced down to the actions of 1, 2, or 3 individuals. That this does not fall solely upon the shoulders of someone like Adolf Hitler or Heinrich Himmler or Joseph Goebbels, not to cut any of them some slack, because they definitely are chief perpetrators, but the everyday actions, the ability to literally systematically kill millions of people, comes through the actions by average people to either willingly participate or sit by as a bystander to what they are witnessing, to what they know what's going on. And so there's different levels of this concept of justice that have to be navigated through and articulated. So sometimes it's literally trying to just remove, the process of denazification is just trying to remove symbols or images or names of streets, right, from various cities or towns in Germany, as you see there on the left, right? That they take down the name of a street, Adolf Hitler Strasse, and name it Roosevelt Boulevard, right? I don't think that street is still named Roosevelt Boulevard today, but you follow what I'm saying. But the biggest kind of opportunity for this is this thing called the Nuremberg trials, which many of you may be familiar with. Now, the individuals, as I mentioned to you just a second ago, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, Heinrich Himmler, 3 of the kind of leading Nazi officials, they will never be put on trial because they commit suicide right at the war's end. And so they're never able to, stand and give an account, at least not in this life, for what they've done, right? And so instead, the remaining high-level ranking Nazi officials will be put on trial at the International Military Tribunal that will take place from November of 1945 to October of 1946. Now, this trial, its primary goal is to help show to the world that law and order has been reestablished in Germany. And yes, it is to give an account. In fact, it's at the Nuremberg trials where many of those photos and images and moving pictures that were taken in the liberation process are brought out to a much wider world to know, especially also in what the Soviets had liberated in Eastern Europe and in Poland. It's going to be brought out to a wider world. But it's really limited in how much it's able to actually exact justice. During this trial, and it's intentional, the city of Nuremberg is chosen because Nuremberg was the kind of seen as the center, the heart of the Nazi party, heart of the Nazi movement. It was where they hosted all of their rallies in the early years of the Nazi regime, and you would see images of thousands of people being there. And so it's meant to have this trial there to show Nazism is dead. We are ridding it, right? It's the kind of symbolism behind this. But at the tribunal, 21 of the kind of most important military and political leaders who were still living were brought on trial. There's a combination of allied lawyers from the 4 different allied nations of the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. And these crimes, you would be brought on trial for either membership in a criminal organization, 2, wage aggressive war, 3, war crimes, and 4, a really new category that had not kind of been used before in a sense of military consequences or military trials, was crimes against humanity, right? So this is kind of new category for what the Holocaust is representing. So of those 21 defendants, 19 of them are going to be convicted. 12 are sentenced to death. 3 defendants were sentenced to life imprisonment, 4 to prison terms ranging somewhere between 10 to 20 years, and 3 of them are acquitted altogether. One of the one of the highest ranking officials that was still alive at these, Hermann Goering, who would be sentenced to execution, he actually kills himself the night before his execution. So while this is the kind of public display of justice, this is put on newsreels, right? You and I can watch news on our phone or just about anywhere now. People would actually go to the movies and watch newsreels of this trial going on. This is how you learned about it. This is how you saw what was going on. This is what you kind of kept you aware of the events. So it's giving you, having seen and having heard or having read or seen pictures of what was coming out of liberated Germany, then said, okay, we've got justice here, right? We've got the bad guys, and we've now we've either put them to death or we've put them in prison, or we're kind of can wipe our hands of this in a sense of the word. Now, there were a series of trials that would take place after kind of the big initial trial from November to October 45 to 46. Another like 177 high-ranking officials are going to be tried. So there's lower levels. Those don't get as much attention as these big ones do. But the reality is that even if you get 177 other high-ranking Nazi officials, as well as the kind of initial big 21 that they got, this still doesn't help us totally summarize down to how this is possible. And so this, I think, really speaks to the limitations of justice. Because we've got this other event that's coming, and it's already kind of looming at this stage, and that is the Cold War. That is this ideological battle that the United States is kind of positioning itself against with the Soviet Union. And the United States wants to make sure that the Soviet Union doesn't gain one more inch of territory in Germany than it already has. And it wants to ensure that democracy, liberal democracy, will take root in Germany. So if we've gotten rid of the Nazis, we can replace it with liberal democracy so that they don't get drawn into the possibility of being pulled into a Soviet-style communism. And particularly there was a concern about that because of the utter destruction that the war has brought, when people have literally no food, no homes, very little to go on, very little to build their lives off of. And here comes an ideology that comes sweeping in saying it's going to provide these things to you, it's going to provide this better way, then you might find that very appealing. And so the United States, we have to make sure that doesn't happen, right? So we want to reestablish law and order through this kind of very visual trial, but we still got to deal with the fact that we've got millions of average Germans who, again, actively participated or were complicit in what had taken place. But you can't put all of them in jail, because then how do you have a government? How do you have this liberal democracy if everybody who was participating, because in some way or another, other than the victims themselves, everyone is complicit in some form or fashion? How do you move forward? And so the idea really becomes an effort to re-educate through things like making sure people are aware of what the crimes were that were being committed. There's also, of course, the removal of visual symbols and such. But they also do something that is referred to, or that the Allies, and particularly the British and the Americans do, and they make former Nazis fill out a questionnaire. It's called the Fragebogen, which sounds really silly, right? But it's like 131 questions that you had to fill out that allowed Allied officials to evaluate your level of complicity. And so if you were just kind of like a low-level Nazi, well, we'll let you get by, right? We'll let you kind of come on in, and there's no big deal. We need you to kind of keep doing what you're going to do. Because if you remember from Dr. Sipes' lecture a few weeks ago, we have just the actual reality of like running towns and running communities, and like we just got to get this thing moving again. And so they'll have to overlook a lot of this. But that doesn't mean that people at the time didn't see the problems in this. Both, of course, victims of the Nazi regime, as well as those who were active resistors. I mean, there are people who are resisting the Nazi regime throughout its existence. I kind of will, some ways, close with this relationship of connection to justice. This is a caricature that's published in a German magazine, and it's called Black Becomes White, or Automatic Denazification. And there's a poem at the bottom. It's written in German, and I'm going to read it for you. And I realize that maybe for some of you in the room, you're not able to see this, but what it's basically showing you here is, let me hope this pointer works. Okay, good. Up there at the top, we've got these these black sheep who are going into what is seemingly a machine that says like a denazification machine. It then comes out at the other end, and they're nice little snow white lambs, okay? And so the poem at the bottom, and I have it written for you here on the screen, says, "Jump right in. What can happen to you, you black sheep from the brown house?" And the brown house is a referral to the Nazis and their colors, the brown shirts. "You'll be painlessly rehabilitated. You'll come out as snow white lambs. You know, we know, you were never involved. The other ones were always the guilty ones. How quickly the bad turned into good. Here you see it in black and white." So this caricature is kind of detailing for us the ironic and critical way, and then also the problematic results of the denazification program. That you can kind of strip these symbols, you can strip and maybe even whitewash the background a little bit in order to ensure that this kind of vision that you have for a Western Germany can move forward. But it doesn't always mean that the ideology or the perpetrators of that ideology have fully paid the price for what they have done. So that kind of brings us to the point where this is where the role of memory falls into. This is the point as to what individuals like Eisenhower and Bradley were trying to argue for, and then what these soldiers who took pictures and wrote letters home were trying to do, is recognizing that this could not be forgotten. And I don't know if any of you picked up on both the quote I read from Eisenhower and from Bradley, but they both mention the concern about the possibility that these things could be told as propaganda, that they could be falsified, that these things maybe really didn't happen, that there's going to be an effort to try and deny what took place. And I think that's really telling, that even in the immediacy of seeing these events happen and trying to understand what had taken place, that they understood that there was a possibility that one day there's going to be a way that people are going to try and deny that this actually happened. And so one of the only ways that we can work against that is through education. This is why you're all here, right? And the extra credit, I get that. But is that this is why you're here, right? Is that you are here so that these things, you can't walk away saying, I just didn't know. I just didn't know. And in fact, this last picture I have for you here, this was a special exhibit that the Library of Congress put on in June of 1945, so just a month after the end of the war, and it was called Lest We Forget. And they took the photos and the images that were captured by those soldiers, and they blew them up into large life-size pictures, and they put them out on display for people to come and see. And they titled it "Lest We Forget." So there was an immediate effort right at the end of the war, in the immediate aftermath, to say we have to remember this event. We must not walk away with knowing it. We must not walk away with acting as though we didn't know what happened, right? And now that we do know, maybe we didn't do as much as we should have at the height of when it was going on, or taking actions early on, but now we know, because the idea is that we can make sure that it never happens again. And I think this relationship that the United States has with the Holocaust, because sometimes I get asked by students, why do we have a whole museum in Washington, D.C., which is fantastic, by the way, if you ever get to go, dedicated to the Holocaust? Why do we have it? And I think a lot of it is because what happens here in this process, and we feel the responsibility. The United States felt the responsibility that they had a need to carry this on, right, to make sure that these things were going to be remembered. And so that we too have to carry on that responsibility, right, that we too have to make sure that we're remembering what took place, and fight against the possibility of those who try to suggest that it didn't actually happen, or that they diminish what actually took place, or that's usually oftentimes where we see it the most, is that there's not a whole-scale denial that there was a loss of life, or a whole-scale denial of some of these things, but they try to nitpick and try and say, well, it wasn't that bad, or it wasn't just Jews, or it wasn't just whatever. They try to caveat it and make it as if it wasn't as bad as it was. So this is a charge, right, to you as listeners of this, as you walk away from here today, that, you intentionally make an opportunity to say, I'm going to remember this, and I'm going to make sure others remember it. Because if you don't think that this could happen here, you are fooling yourself, right? That average Germans are more like us today than we are not like them, okay? This shows you the power of an ideology, shows you the power of an idea, and what it can convince people to do to other people that results in the massive loss of human life. So that was, I'm sorry, I know, very depressing. It's not the best way that you want to kind of spend your Thursday afternoon. But I hope you found it instructive. If this is something that interests you, that you'd like more information on, I'm actually leading a study abroad this coming May to Germany. We're going to be visiting the concentration camp of Dachau. We're also going to be visiting the concentration camp of Sachsenhausen. We're going to be visiting the site of the Nuremberg trials, as well as where the Nuremberg rallies took place. So if you haven't, you're like, wow, I'd like to actually see this. I'd like to take this charge for memory and memorializing this and understanding this better. This would be an awesome opportunity for you. So thank you again to Dr. Archer for this event, and thanks everybody for coming. And I'll open up to any questions you may have.